The pavilion smelled of charcoal and performative happiness. I sat at the weathered table's edge, nursing lukewarm Pinot Grigio. The laughter around my younger brother, Gavin, died instantly when my father's brother sat down opposite me. Uncle Michael smiled at me and asked, "How's life? In that $1.5 million house you purchased?" My brother stopped bragging about his vacation photos. My parents exchanged panicked looks. My mom whispered, "Michael, what house?" And I calmly sipped my wine as Uncle Michael continued. The silence that descended wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum. A moment ago, 73 relatives had been captive to Gavin's slideshow of Cabo San Lucas projected onto a portable screen. He was tan, loud, and radiating the confidence of someone whose credit card bills were paid by his parents. Now, the projector hummed in the quiet, casting a bright, overexposed image of a margarita across my father's stunned face. The contrast between Gavin's subsidized luxury and my hidden reality felt like a physical blow to the room. My mother, Linda, blinked rapidly, her brain clearly trying to reject the data Uncle Michael had just introduced. In her world, I was Raymond the ghost, the background character who worked with computers and lived in a nondescript apartment. She looked from Michael to me, a nervous giggle bubbling up in her throat. She expected me to correct him. She waited for me to say it was a rental, or a joke, or perhaps a misunderstanding about a video game. I didn't say a word. Gavin lowered his phone, his thumb hovering over a picture of a sea turtle. For 30 years, he had been the protagonist of this family. His scraped knees were tragedies. His promotions were national holidays. The idea that I had achieved something massive without consulting the audience was foreign to him. He looked at me with a mix of confusion and irritation, as if I had spoken out of turn during his soliloquy. He waited for Mom to fix the script, but she was frozen. Uncle Michael remained cheerfully oblivious to the tectonic shift he had caused. He reached for a deviled egg, completely ignoring the tension radiating from my father. Michael was the only one who treated me like an adult peer rather than a defective child. He assumed my parents knew, because in a normal family, parents celebrated their children's victories. He took a bite of the egg and looked around. "Seriously, Robert, the restoration work on that craftsmanship is award-winning. You must be incredibly proud." My father's jaw worked, but no sound came out. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in a decade. He wasn't seeing his son. He was seeing a stranger who had outpaced his expectations by $1 million. I took another slow sip of wine, tasting the cheap acidity, and let the silence stretch. I could have saved them right then. I could have downplayed it. Instead, I set my cup down on the plastic tablecloth and smiled. "You are funny," my mother said, her voice pitched painfully high. She reached for a napkin, shredding the corner into white confetti. "Raymond rents an apartment in the city. A studio, actually. We helped him move a mattress in 5 years ago." She looked at me, eyes pleading for collaboration in this comfortable lie. "Tell him, Ray. Tell your uncle he's got you mixed up with a client." The desperate hope in her gaze was pathetic. She needed me to be small so her world made sense. I didn't reach for the lifeline she threw me. Instead, I let it sink. "I moved out of the studio 3 years ago, Mom," I said, my voice steady against the rising breeze. "The house isn't a rental. I closed on the property April 22nd. I saw Gavin's mouth drop open, a piece of shrimp toast forgotten in his hand. The specific date acted like a weapon. It wasn't a vague claim. It was a hard calendar entry they had missed entirely. To ensure there was no wiggle room, I continued with the audit. It's a 1920s craftsman in the Laurelhurst district. I put $400,000 down and financed the rest at 6.5%. The numbers landed on the table like heavy stones. $400,000. That was more than my parents' entire retirement fund. The air left the vicinity of the picnic table. Cousins at the next bench stopped chewing. My financial reality was suffocating their assumptions. My father stood up, his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. He didn't look proud, he looked betrayed. "Where the hell did you get that kind of money?" he demanded, ignoring the listening relatives. "You work in data entry, Raymond. Did you get in trouble? Is this some crypto gambling nonsense?" He couldn't conceive of a world where I earned this legitimately. In his mind, competence belonged to Gavin, and trouble was the only explanation for me. "I haven't done data entry since I was 22. I corrected him gently. "I am a director of data science now. I manage a team of 40 people and 3 budgets." I took a sip of water, watching the information hit him. He blinked, the anger faltering into confusion. He didn't know my job title. He didn't know my industry. He had created a fictional version of his son to ignore, and that fiction was dissolving in front of 70 people. Uncle Michael wiped his hands on a paper towel, sensing the hostility radiating from his brother. "Wait, you haven't seen it." He looked at my parents, genuinely baffled. "I stopped by last week when I was in town for the conference. The library alone is magnificent. Original built-ins, Robert. You love woodwork." He pulled out his phone. I took pictures. That was the nail in the coffin. Michael had been a guest in a home my parents didn't know existed. Michael tapped his screen and turned it toward my mother. A photo of my living room, with its coffered ceilings and the restored fireplace, glowed in the afternoon shade. My mother stared at the small screen, as if it were an alien artifact. She couldn't claim it was a lie anymore. The proof was right there, validated by a third party. They looked at me not with pride, but with the terrified realization that they didn't know the stranger sitting across from them. Gavin laughed, but it was a brittle, dry sound that cracked the tension. He tossed his phone onto the table, abandoning the Cabo photos. "Come on, Ray. 400 grand cash." "There's no way." He looked at our parents for backup, slipping comfortably into his role as the favored prosecutor. "You've never even owned a car worth more than 5 grand. Did you borrow it from a shark? Or are you dealing?" His insecurity was wearing a thin, transparent disguise of concern. "I haven't borrowed a cent since college," I said, leaning back against the rough wood of the picnic bench. The judgment in their eyes needed to be excised with precision. "I started as a junior analyst 8 years ago. Promoted to senior analyst in 18 months. Team lead 2 years after that." I ticked the milestones off on my fingers, watching Gavin's smirk falter. VP of Analytics at a fintech firm by 29. Director now. I recited the resume they never asked to see. My father scoffed, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "Titles are just words, Raymond. Companies hand them out like candy to keep you working late." He wanted desperately to believe I was still the struggling son who needed his wisdom. I decided to end the charade. "My base salary is $290,000. I said, loud enough for Aunt Sarah at the next table to freeze. With annual bonuses and equity, I cleared $350,000 last year. The number hit the table like a grenade. The chatter at the surrounding tables died instantly. A fly buzzed near the potato salad, the only sound in the pavilion. Aunt Sarah turned fully around in her seat, her plastic fork hovering mid-air. Cousins who usually looked right through me were now staring with hungry, reassessing eyes. They weren't looking at the quiet cousin anymore. They were looking at the wealthiest man in the pavilion. The social hierarchy had just been violently inverted. My mother's face went pale, her lips parting as she tried to reconcile her internal narrative with this new reality. 300. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. She looked at Uncle Michael, then back to me, realization dawning. It wasn't just that I was successful. It was that she had absolutely no idea. The whispers started behind us. They weren't whispering about my money. They were whispering about how Linda and Robert didn't know a thing about their own son. But the loans. My father stammered, grasping for a familiar struggle to hold on to. We're still paying on Gavin's degree. You must be drowning in debt with a mortgage like that. He needed me to be drowning. It was the only way he could stay afloat as the patriarch. I shook my head slowly. I paid off my student loans 4 years ago, Dad. In full. I looked at Gavin. I assumed you guys were almost done with his by now. Gavin flinched as if I'd slapped him. The mention of his debts, still serviced by our parents despite his luxury lifestyle, stripped him naked in front of the family. He grabbed his drink, knuckles white, staring hatefully at the brother he used to pity. The dynamic was dead. I wasn't the invisible struggling artist they imagined. I was the bank, and they were the bad investment. The numbers hung in the humid air, turning their neglect into a quantifiable metric. You never told us. My mother whispered, tears spilling over her lashes in a practiced display of grief. She looked around the table, seeking an audience for her sudden martyrdom. We would have celebrated you, Raymond. Why would you hide this from your own family? It's cruel to look us look like fools in front of everyone. She reached for my father's hand, cementing their alliance against my apparent deception. To the onlookers, her performance was compelling. I reached into my pocket. I didn't hide anything, I said, placing my phone on the plastic tablecloth. The screen brightness was set to max, cutting through the pavilion's shade like a searchlight. April 22nd. The day of closing. I tapped the message thread pinned under Mom and Dad. Here is the text I sent at 4:15 p.m. Closed on the house today. So excited to finally be a homeowner. 1920s craftsman in Laurelhurst. Can't wait to show you both. The text bubble was blue. I turned the screen so they could see the timestamp clearly. You didn't reply for 6 hours. I noted, keeping my voice clinical to counteract her emotion. And when you did, you didn't call. You didn't ask for a tour. You didn't even type a single word. I pointed to the tiny icon attached to my life-changing news. You tapped a thumbs up. That was the sum total of your enthusiasm for the biggest purchase of my life. My father squinted at the screen, his face going gray. We were busy that week, Raymond. Gavin was having that crisis with his transmission. I swiped up on the interface. I called 3 times that day. Noon, 1, and 4:30. The red missed call icons lined up like bullet holes on the screen. You sent me 14 texts that same week, asking if I'd seen the video of Gavin's dog. You weren't too busy. You just didn't care. Uncle Michael reached across the table gently, breaking the standoff. May I? He asked. I slid the device toward him. He didn't look at the texts, he opened the photo gallery. People need to see this, he murmured. He turned the phone toward Aunt Sarah and the cousins hovering nearby. Look at that porch, Michael said, his voice projecting to the back row. He restored the original cedar siding himself. Stripped 20 layers of paint. The device made its way around the circle like a hot coal.
Oh, wow.
My cousin Jessica breathed, zooming in on the kitchen island. This is in Laurelhurst. That's near the botanical gardens. She looked up at my parents, her expression hardening. You guys seriously never went to see this? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was an indictment. My mother shrank in her seat, realizing her tears were no longer generating sympathy. The evidence was in 4K resolution. The phone eventually circled back to Uncle Michael, who set it down with reverence. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at the half-eaten potato salad, realizing his narrative control was gone. It wasn't a secret, Michael said softly, looking at his brother with disappointment. It was just a channel you tuned out. I locked my phone, the screen going black. It wasn't just a missed call, it was a documented history of apathy. The silence needed a new voice to shatter it completely. Grandma Helen, 90 years of iron wool wrapped in floral print, tapped her cane loudly against the concrete slab. Raymond, she rasped, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a serrated knife. How long have you lived in this house? The one with the rose garden I just saw in that picture. She stared at my mother, who was busy trying to wipe a non-existent smudge off the table. My mother froze. 3 months, Grandma. I answered clearly, ensuring the timeline was understood. I moved in mid-April. I watched my father shift his weight, looking uncomfortable under his mother's intense scrutiny. I have a guest room on the ground floor. It has its own bath and a view of the garden. I let that detail hang there. It was a subtle invitation she would have loved, had she known it existed. I have invited Mom and Dad several times since the closing. Grandma turned her head slowly toward her son, her eyes sharp. Robert, how far is Laurelhurst from your driveway? My father cleared his throat, looking for an exit that didn't exist. About 40 minutes. Ma. Maybe 45 with traffic. Grandma nodded, her expression tightening. And how many times have you visited? The number 0 hung in the air before he could speak. It wasn't just a lack of travel, it was a lack of effort. He couldn't even lie about it now. I decided to provide the context they were afraid of. For the record, I said, my voice devoid of anger, which made it worse. According to Gavin's social media posts, you have visited his rented apartment 19 times in the last 12 months. I looked at my brother. You went there to fix a shelf, to drop off groceries, to walk his dog. 19 trips for the son who needed help. 0 for the son who built a library. Gavin slammed his hand on the table, the plastic cutlery jumping. That's because I needed them? He shouted, his face patchy with embarrassment. I had the transmission issue, and then the landlord problems. They were helping me survive, Ray. They've been busy keeping my head above water. He thought he was defending them. In reality, he was confirming that their love was transactional, currency exchange for incompetence. He looked around, expecting validation from the group, but saw only pity. A cousin from the teenage table, a kid named Leo who usually had headphones on, pulled one ear cup back. Wait, he said, his voice cracking slightly. So Ray bought a mansion by himself, and Gavin needs help buying groceries. It was a crude summary, but devastatingly accurate. My father looked as if he'd been gutted. His role as the provider was being mocked by a 14-year-old. The myth of the perfect family dissolved into a balance sheet of favoritism. My mother reached for Gavin's arm, instinctively trying to soothe the child who demanded the most noise. She didn't reach for me. She never had. We did the best we could, she whispered, a mantra that excused 3 decades of neglect. We thought Raymond was fine. I looked at her. Really looked at her. I was fine, I said quietly. That was my crime. I didn't need you, so you didn't see me. The truth wasn't just rejection. It was invisibility. The sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, distorted shadows across the grass. I threw my paper plate into the trash can, the thud echoing the finality I felt deep in my chest. Around me, the reunion was dissolving into awkward clusters of people, whispering discreetly behind their hands. I didn't say goodbye to anyone but Grandma Helen, who had squeezed my hand with surprising, bony strength. I walked toward the parking lot, my keys heavy in my pocket, ready to escape the suffocating air. I didn't make it to the asphalt before they intercepted me. My mother moved faster than I had seen her move in years, planting herself between me and my sedan. Her makeup was streaked, her eyes wide with a frantic energy that felt more like panic than affection. My father stood just behind her, his posture rigid, like a sentry guarding a crumbling fortress. They weren't there to apologize. They were there to negotiate a cease-fire before I left the premises. Raymond, please, you can't just leave like this. My mother pleaded, reaching for my arm but stopping short of actually touching me. We want to come see the house. Next weekend. We'll bring that brisket you always used to like. She was smiling, but it was a rictus of terror and shame. She was trying to overwrite the last hour with a brisket and a forced visit. Slept. She wanted to pretend that 30 years of indifference could be fixed with a single Sunday dinner conversation. I looked at the space where her hand almost touched me. I don't eat brisket anymore, Mom. I haven't for over 10 years. The detail was small, but it was proof of how little she knew. And next weekend doesn't work for me. Neither does the weekend after that, either. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was just being honest. I didn't want them in my sanctuary. The thought of them walking through my restored library, with their judgment, made my stomach turn. My father stepped forward, his shadow falling over me. Now you listen here. He growled, his voice low and harsh so the stragglers wouldn't hear. We are your parents. You owe us the chance to make this right. You don't just shut us out because of a misunderstanding or pride. He was trying to summon the authority of a patriarch. But he had no capital left to spend with me. He thought biology granted him endless credit. He didn't realize his account had been closed. I don't owe you anything, I said, my voice terrifyingly calm even to my own ringing ears. You didn't co-sign my loans. You didn't help me move. You didn't answer my calls when I achieved the biggest, most expensive milestone of my life. I looked him in the eye, watching his bluster fade into shock and confusion. I built that life despite your neglect, not because of your support. You don't get to claim equity in a project you refused to invest in when it mattered. My mother flinched as if I had struck her physically across the face. We love you, Raymond, she sobbed, but her eyes darted toward Aunt Sarah, who was watching from her car. We didn't know how to relate to you or your job. I shook my head slowly. You are only doing this because you were embarrassed in front of an audience of our relatives, I told her. If Uncle Michael hadn't said anything, you would have let me sit in silence while you praised Gavin. The truth of that statement hung between us, heavy, cold, and undeniable. I almost didn't come today, I admitted, watching the color drain from my father's aging face. I told myself this was the last time. One final test to see if you could ask me a single question about my life without being prompted by guilt. I unlocked my car, the beep chirping loudly in the quiet dusk. You failed the test before I even sat down. Michael passed it for you. And you still failed. My father looked at his shoes, the weight of the moment finally crushing his stubborn defenses. We can fix this? He muttered, but it sounded like a question rather than a statement of fact. I don't think you can, I replied. You can't learn 30 years of history in an afternoon. You don't know who I am, and frankly, I don't have the energy to teach you from scratch. I opened the driver's side door. The barrier between us was now metal, glass, and indifference. As I settled into the leather seat, I realized something profound. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger implies expectation, a lingering hope that things should be different. I had no hope left, and that void was filled with a strange, cool, and absolute peace. I looked at them through the open window one last time. They looked small, huddled together against the encroaching dark of the park. I realized I wasn't leaving my family behind. I was leaving behind the ghost of the son they never wanted to know. The engine turned over with a quiet, expensive hum, vibrating gently through the leather steering wheel. Before I could shift into reverse, a sweaty hand slammed hard against the driver's side window. Gavin stood there, his face twisted into a mask of childish fury, his knuckles white against the tinted glass. He shouted something muted by the soundproofing, his mouth moving in jagged, angry shapes. I didn't want to roll it down, but I needed this to be finished properly. I lowered the glass 2 inches, letting the humid summer air hiss into the cabin. You did that on purpose. Gavin spat, his breath smelling of cheap beer and anxiety. You waited until the slideshow started. You wanted to humiliate them. He wasn't talking about mom and dad. He was talking about himself. He was humiliated because his vacation looked cheap compared to my mortgage. They're crying, Ray. Mom is a mess because of you. He pointed back at the pavilion where our parents stood like statues. He wanted me to feel the weight of their sadness, but I only felt the lightness of release. I didn't bring it up. I said, my voice cutting through his hysteria. Uncle Michael asked a question. I just answered it. I looked at his shirt, a designer polo I knew Dad paid for last Christmas. If the truth ruins the party, Gavin, then it wasn't a party. It was a play. He recoiled, blinking rapidly. He hated when I used logic. It made him feel small. And Gavin's entire personality was built around being the biggest person in the room without earning the stature. You don't need them, he hissed, leaning closer to the gap in the window. You have all this money. You have the house. Why do you need to take their pride too? There it was. The core of the issue. He saw our parents as a resource he had exclusive mining rights to. My success threatened his supply chain. I didn't take their pride, I told him. I just stopped feeding their delusion that we are on the same level. He stared at me, mouth agape. They don't love you more, Gavin, I said, watching the painful realization hit him. They just control you more. You are dependent on them, and that makes them feel useful. I shifted the car into reverse, the backup camera illuminating the gravel behind me. I am free. You are a pet they keep around to feel important. His face went slack. It was a cruel thing to say, but it was the kind of cruelty that cauterized a wound. He needed to know that his golden cage wasn't a throne. I hit the button, and the window slid up, sealing him out. His shouting was instantly muffled, reduced to the pantomime of an angry ghost. I backed out of the parking spot, the tires crunching loudly on the dry gravel. He didn't chase the car. He just stood there, looking suddenly very young and very lost. For the first time, I didn't feel jealousy toward him. Pity washed over me, cold and detached. He was stuck in a time loop I had just broken out of. Near the exit, a silver sedan was idling. Uncle Michael leaned against the hood, smoking a cigarette he wasn't allowed to have at home. He saw me coming and straightened up. He didn't wave like a frantic relative. He gave me a sharp, single nod, a salute. It was an acknowledgement between equals, a silent confirmation that I had done the hard, necessary thing. I nodded back, keeping my hands on the wheel. That single gesture meant more than 30 years of my father's empty praise. I pulled to the stop sign at the edge of the park. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Mom flashed on the screen, followed instantly by Dad. They were trying to breach the wall while the mortar was still wet. I picked up the device. I didn't answer. I went to the contacts list, tapped the information icon, and scrolled to the bottom. Block caller. I did it for Mom. Then for Dad. Then, after a heartbeat of hesitation, I did it for Gavin. The silence in the car deepened, but it wasn't lonely. It felt like the silence after a noisy ventilation system finally shuts off. You don't realize how loud the background noise was until it's gone. I merged onto the highway, putting distance between myself and the potato salad, the streamers, and the expectations. I was technically an orphan now, by choice if not by blood. It was a terrifying status to elect. But as the speedometer climbed, the terror faded into a steady, rhythmic calm. As I drove out of the park, the rearview mirror showed them shrinking. Not just in distance, but in significance. The trees swallowed the pavilion, erasing the scene of my liberation. I turned up the radio, a jazz track playing softly, filling the space where their demands used to be. The road to Laurelhorst was open and clear. I wasn't driving away from my home anymore. For the first time in my life, I was driving toward it. The sun set behind me, leaving the past in shadow. The gravel crunch of my driveway sounded different than the chaotic park lot. It sounded like ownership. The sensor lights flickered on, bathing the cedar siding in a warm, welcoming glow. This was my secret, sitting quietly under the canopy of old oaks. I killed the engine and sat for a moment in the garage. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with accomplishment. I wasn't Raymond the invisible son here. I was the architect of my own peace. I stepped out, shoes clicking on concrete. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lemon oil and old books. I walked through the mudroom, dropping keys in the ceramic bowl I'd bought in Kyoto. Every object here had a story my parents would never know. I ran my hand along the hallway. Wainscoting. I had sanded these boards myself on weekends, while they were busy visiting Gavin's rental. The house didn't judge me. It simply existed because I made it exist. It was undeniable proof of my competence. I moved into the kitchen, the heart of the renovation. The quartz countertops gleamed under the pendant lights. I remembered the day the installers came. How I wished I could call my dad to brag about the slab choice. That ache was gone now, replaced by a dull, healing scar. I didn't need his approval to know the stone was solid. I didn't need his permission to be successful. The house wasn't a stage for their validation. It was just my home. I opened the wine fridge and bypassed the cheap peanut. I pulled out a vintage Cabernet I had been saving for a special occasion. Tonight was an Independence Day of sorts. I poured a glass, the dark red liquid swirling against the crystal. My pocket buzzed against my leg. A phantom vibration from a life I had just disconnected. I pulled the phone out. The screen lit up the dim room. It wasn't a blocked call. It was a text from Uncle Michael. Proud of you, Ray. Enjoy the peace. The message was simple, carrying the weight of the father figure I never had. I didn't reply immediately. I didn't need to perform gratitude for him to know we were good. I set the phone face down on the island. The screen went dark, and with it, the last tether to the drama in the park. I wasn't waiting for a thumbs up. I wasn't waiting for a return call. I was just thirsty. I walked out to the back porch and sat in the Adirondack chair. The night air was filled with crickets and the distant hum of the city. I took a sip, letting the wretched tannins coat my tongue. For 30 years, I believed I was invisible because they didn't look at me. I was wrong. I was only invisible because I was hiding in their shadow. I was home, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who lived there.